What is independent living? This module will discuss the ways in which independent living philosophy and concepts differ from the medical model and traditional rehabilitation. This module will also provide familiarity with some of the disability leaders and events that launched, developed, and now sustain the independent living movement. As we learned in Module 1, disability was thought of almost exclusively as a medical, rehabilitation, and charity issue from the 19th century until about 1960. The focus was on searching for medical cures to alleviate disabling conditions. The goal was to either fix people with disabilities or to segregate those who couldn't be fixed in institutions. Let's take a look at how independent living philosophy significantly differs from this traditional medical model rehabilitation paradigm. The medical or rehabilitation paradigm defines disability as a defect in the individual. This way of looking at a disability centers on a medical professional who intervenes in the person's life. This inevitably leads to a social role for the person with a disability as a powerless patient who is dependent on the experts for direction and decisions. Most people in this situation either never gain control or lose any control they did have. Expectations by professionals are generally low in terms of the person with a disability holding a job or living a constructive life. The independent living or IL paradigm and philosophy are very different from this medical model and call for a different way of perceiving and relating to people with disabilities. The problem has been that people with disabilities are often dependent on others to make decisions about their lives. In addition, widespread discrimination toward people with disabilities is a significant issue. In the IL paradigm, disability is considered a natural part of the human experience. Independent living means controlling what is done in your life and making your own decisions. The problem lies in the environmental, social, and economic barriers that people face. The solutions are civil rights protections, removal of barriers, and strong advocacy efforts to make change happen. The desired outcome is a person who controls his or her own life, has opportunities comparable to other citizens, participates in the community as they wish, and who has economic security. There are two different aspects of independent living. Centers for independent living comprise the operational or programmatic aspect of independent living. These centers are private, non-profit, community-based organizations that are consumer-controlled and work with people with all types of disabilities of all ages. By federal law, at least 51% of their staff and governing boards must be people with significant disabilities. The independent living or disability rights movement is the other aspect of independent living. Various organizations, groups, and individuals have participated in this movement over the years with the purpose of securing civil rights, legal protections, and policies for people with disabilities. How, why, and where did this revolutionary change in self and public perception of people with disabilities come about? Who were the leaders involved in initiating this paradigm? We will now address the answers to these questions with the emergence of independent living in the 1960s. The seeds for independent living were originally planted by war veterans who came home with disabilities. In addition, many more people survived accidents, disease, and birth impairments. Life expectancy also increased, often resulting in age-related disabilities. During this time period, other movements, such as the civil rights, self-help, and normalization movements, were quietly building. Parents were starting to organize so their children with disabilities could receive a better education and acceptance. The time was right for social change. During the 1960s and 1970s, a solid philosophical and organizational base was laid for independent living. Lex Frieden and other disability leaders came together at ILRU in 1978 to develop a definition of independent living, a definition still in use today. The movement and organized efforts to protect civil rights have further developed in the following decades. New disability rights organizations and initiatives were launched, with more collaboration and coalition building between national organizations. Many new leaders emerged. Ed Roberts is known as the father of independent living. He had polio at age 16, resulting in quadriplegia and the use of a wheelchair, ventilator, and iron lung. He struggled to be admitted to the University of California at Berkeley. First, he was denied financial help by the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency because they thought he was, quote, not feasible for employment, end quote. Roberts successfully fought this decision, but then Berkeley officials said that they had, quote, admitted cripples before and it didn't work out, end quote. This is not surprising, since accessibility was almost non-existent. With persistence, he was finally admitted in 1962 and lived in the student infirmary. As Roberts learned about what he needed to function successfully at Berkeley, he pressured university officials to make needed changes, such as wheelchair repair, ramps, transportation, and accessible housing. Before long, other people with significant disabilities joined him. They became known as the Rolling Quads and provided other students with assistance concerning disability-related issues. Roberts and a colleague wrote a successful proposal in 1970, resulting in the Physically Disabled Student Program with John Hessler as the director. The new program was overwhelmed with requests for assistance by people with disabilities within the community, so Roberts started a Center for Independent Living in 1972 with a $1 million grant. The Berkeley Center was a community-based, private, non-profit, non-residential program run by people with disabilities for people with all types of disabilities. When Roberts was asked what the 3 most important services were, he answered, advocacy, advocacy, and advocacy. In the early 70s, other programs were developed across the nation based on similar principles. The Boston Center for Independent Living was organized under the leadership of Fred Fay. Lex Frieden, another prominent leader in Houston, founded the Independent Living Research Utilization Program in 1977. In Denver, Wade Blank founded the Atlantis Community, which includes people who once lived in nursing homes. Blank was also the founder of the American Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation, now known as American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today, or ADAPT. This organization carried out its first civil disobedience action in 1978, when it immobilized buses to gain attention for the need for wheelchair public bus lifts in Denver. Roberts became director of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living in 1974. In 1975, Roberts was appointed by the California governor to be the state director of the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency, which just 14 years earlier had deemed him too disabled to work. Judy Heumann is known as the mother of independent living. She had polio as an infant, which resulted in quadriplegia. Upon graduating from college and passing all the required exams, Heumann applied for her teaching certificate. She was denied because officials determined that she would constitute a fire hazard in a school, the same reason given for keeping her out of regular school classes earlier. She immediately sued the school district in 1970 and won. She was later quoted as saying, "When I speak out about the oppression of people with disabilities, some professionals will ask, is she bitter about being handicapped? The answer is yes, I am bitter about being handicapped, but not about having a disability, for it is not my disability that handicaps me. It is society that handicaps me, and my brothers and sisters. Handicaps us by building inaccessible schools, theaters, buses, houses, and the list goes on. All this helps keep us in our place." She organized a contingent of people with disabilities in New York City called Disabled in Action, DIA. DIA groups were also formed in Philadelphia and Baltimore. In 1971, she observed that there is not one large national foundation working for the handicapped that has a disabled person on its board. When President Nixon vetoed the new Rehabilitation Act passed by Congress in 1972 because he said it was too costly, DIA shut down traffic on Madison Avenue in New York with about 80 people with disabilities in protest. This legislation contained funding for independent living centers and the very first provision to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities against discrimination. Section 504 states, "No otherwise qualified handicapped individual shall be excluded from participation in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance." In 1973, Congress sent Nixon a bill with Section 504, but without the independent living provisions and funding, which he finally signed. When the required regulations had not been implemented by 1976, even after prodding by disability groups, it became clear that delay was being used as a means not to honor the law. In the meantime, Judy Heumann had joined Ed Roberts at the Berkeley Independent Living Center as the deputy director. A cross-disability organization called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities gave President Carter an ultimatum date for the Section 504 regulations. When the ultimatum date passed with no regulations, protests took place at 10 regional health, education, and welfare offices across the country. Most lasted a day, but under Heumann's leadership in San Francisco, approximately 150 people with all types of disabilities and at great risk to their health stayed for 28 days and refused to leave until the regulations were signed. They left the building after 28 days of occupation, 2 days after the regulations were signed, having read and approved them. They were singing, "We have overcome." This prolonged event was electric for people with disabilities all across the nation. The Disabilities Rights Education and Defense Fund, founded in 1977 by Mary Lou Breslin, Bob Funk, and Patricia Wright, provided training on the provisions of 504 to thousands of people with disabilities across the country between 1979 and 1982. These founders fought protracted battles to keep the 504 legislation intact. They were later active in the formulation and passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. In 1978, a reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act contained provisions for Centers for Independent Living, and $2 million was appropriated to fund 10 states around the country. Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, and Joan Leon came together again in the early 1980s to found the World Institute on Disability, a national think tank and research organization. Its purpose was to address independent living and broaden its scope in the world. In 1982, the directors of the original Centers for Independent Living decided to start an organization called the National Council on Independent Living, or NICL. Marta Bristow of Access Living in Chicago and Max Starklov of Paraquad in St. Louis were instrumental in founding this organization. NICL has become a major national leader and strong advocate for disability, civil rights, legislation, policies, and issues. Bristow was later appointed by President Clinton to chair the National Council on Disability. One of the significant advances of the independent living movement took place at Gallaudet University, a college for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. In 1988, a new president of Gallaudet was to be appointed. The selection committee chose a woman who had no hearing loss and could not use American Sign Language, or ASL. No previous president in Gallaudet's 100-plus years of existence had been deaf or hearing impaired. The students, who had previously called for a president who was deaf, immediately revolted and shut down the university. After a week of rallies and marches, the Board of Trustees relented and appointed I. King Jordan, the first Gallaudet president who was deaf. This event was a significant victory for people with disabilities everywhere. It demonstrated the power of unified advocacy and provided consumer control at a high level. Another very significant victory was the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. Many people worked to get this legislation passed, but only a few of the leaders will be noted here. Justin Dart and his wife Yoshiko gathered data from across the country at their own expense to document discrimination. The National Council on the Handicapped, later renamed the National Council on Disability, or NCD, under the leadership of Lex Frieden, published Toward Independence and other influential reports on the status of people with disabilities. 2 years after publication of Toward Independence, the NCD observed that no bill had been written to carry out the principles advanced in its groundbreaking document. Consequently, the Council produced another report on the threshold of independence, which included the initial draft proposal of a bill that led the way to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Patricia Wright of DREDF directed advocates' congressional contacts. Liz Savage, then of the Epilepsy Foundation, focused on grassroots advocacy. Under Marka Bristow's leadership, Nickel carried out a variety of advocacy activities. ADAPT, with the leadership of Wade Blank and Bob Kafka, held a crawl up the steps of the United States Capitol building and a rally in the Rotunda that generated a lot of attention. The National Council on Disability and many other organizations and individuals also advocated persistently. After many revisions, the ADA was signed into law July 26, 1990. The disability community was jubilant. Many organizations still celebrate the anniversary of the signing. Around this time, Nickel opened its Washington office and began to work more closely with ADAPT. In 1994, the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, or APRIL, held its first national conference under the leadership of Linda Gonzalez. It is the national voice for Rural Centers for Independent Living. ILRU in Houston continued its support of Centers for Independent Living through programs of research, training, and technical assistance. During this time period, 3 other important organizations were founded. In 1994, Justice for All, a computer listserv dedicated to getting information out to the disability community in a timely manner, was founded by Justin Dart, Fred Fay, Becky Ogle, and Mark Smith. The next year, the American Association of People with Disabilities was founded by Justin Dart, Paul Hearn, and Fred Fay. This is a cross-disability organization created to empower people with disabilities economically and politically. Diane Coleman, the Illinois director of a Center for Independent Living, founded Not Dead Yet in 1996, concerned with preventing assisted suicide and euthanasia targeted almost exclusively toward people with disabilities. These organizations have furthered the independent living movement. Unfortunately, the movement lost the esteemed leadership of Wade Blank, Ed Roberts, and Justin Dart, who all passed away. In 1999, the disability movement got a big boost from the Supreme Court. The Olmstead decision essentially stated that it was discriminatory for states to keep people with disabilities in segregated institutions when they could live in the community with appropriate supports. The decision was based on provisions of the ADA. At the same time, the Supreme Court has handed down a number of decisions that have narrowed the scope of the ADA. Many other organizations and individuals are attempting to counteract these weakening attacks through new legislation or other means. The Free Our People March from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. in 2003 was undertaken to raise public awareness of the need for changes in the Medicaid law to eliminate the bias which mandates Medicaid payment for institutional care, such as nursing homes, but makes support for people to live in the community optional. Over 200 people walked and rolled the distance. More than 80 electric wheelchairs had to be hooked up to battery chargers every night on the way. It was a huge logistical effort. The march culminated in a rally near the Capitol in Washington, D.C., with many congressmen and activists in attendance to promote the passage of the Medicaid Attendant Services and Supports Act and support the independent living movement. The emergence of the independent living movement has been a long, difficult process, and the movement has not yet fully matured. Although it has changed the way many people with disabilities think of themselves and the way many others perceive them, it still has a long way to go. The movement, with its revolutionary concepts, has barely begun to penetrate the psyche of the general public. Until more of the general public and people with disabilities understand and embrace the paradigm shift to civil rights from medical charity models, there likely will be further vigorous attempts to weaken the ADA and to reject changes to Social Security and other disability-related laws that would free people with disabilities to make their own choices and control their own lives. We have an excellent start, but we need every staff person in Centers for Independent Living to understand and support the independent living philosophy, to grasp what is at stake here for people with disabilities, and to always tailor their activities to promote the independent living movement. To view Module 2, Emergence of Independent Living, press Enter. To access Module 1, A Brief History of Disability, press the arrow up key once. To access Module 3, Codification of Independent Living, It is the Law, press the arrow down key once. To view Module 2, Emergence of Independent Living, press Enter. To access Module 1, A Brief History of Disability, press the arrow up key once. To access Module 3, Codification of Independent Living, It is the Law, press the arrow down key once. To view Module 2, Emergence of Independent Living, press Enter. To access Module 1, A Brief History of Disability, press the arrow up key once. To access Module 3, Codification of Independent Living, It is the Law, press the arrow down key once. To view Module 2, Emergence of Independent Living,